So we're going to go back and forth. I'm going to have a couple of general questions for James and Chase that they'll go back and forth and respond to. And then, because I think they view their work differently, we'll have some questions that are more specific to James's and Chase's work. First question to James. Would you characterize your work as ethical? And why?
Yes, I believe it's ethical to expose misconduct, unethical behavior in society. I think that's what the purpose of journalism is. Particularly publicly funded organizations like ACORN, NPR, Medicaid. You look at the 1990s, you see ABC News' Primetime Live with Diane Sawyer used to use hidden cameras to set up private citizens in department stores in New York City. Well, if it's ethical for a large media corporation to use hidden cameras against private citizens, why is it not ethical for me to use hidden cameras against publicly funded, taxpayer-funded government organizations? So there's certainly a double standard when you hear a lot of the journalists say that it's immoral or unethical. I think that it's important in a democracy to have openness, transparency. So I think that showcasing abuse in areas where there's no expectation of privacy, I don't believe there is an expectation of privacy in the ACORN office, or when you're meeting someone for lunch and you're claimed to be an organization that wants to spread Sharia law. I think that it's perfectly ethical, and you don't take my word for it. Just look at all the investigative reporters throughout the 20th century who've been using these tactics for decades. So I just take a look at their work, and we do similar things.
Why do you think the double standard exists?
Because of politics. Because it comes down to this, unfortunately. We have investigated the sacred cows. You're not supposed to investigate ACORN. You're not supposed. Planned Parenthood helps people, James. I know there are people in this audience thinking that. In fact, when I was I went to CNN before I was about 22 or so, and I was trying to get a job as a journalist. And they asked me what I had done, and I said, well, I did this thing with Planned Parenthood. And one of the individuals at CNN actually said, why would you investigate Planned Parenthood? I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, why would you do that? Because they get hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer money. Yeah, but they help women. Why would you target an organization that helps? So to answer your question, people disagree with people who like NPR and who like the current president and who like Planned Parenthood do not want these organizations to be exposed. But mark my words, if I did this to Halliburton or National Rifle Association or the Republican National Committee or Karl Rove, I'd have Academy Awards, Peabodys, Pulitzers, Oprah, book deals. I'd be the greatest thing since sliced bread. But because we go after organizations that are close to the hearts and minds of the intelligentsia, then we'll be poor, we'll be, working out of a basement, with very little to show for it.
So Chase, same question. Is your work ethical?
Yeah, I think so. We ask people questions, and then they answer them, and we leave their answers generally intact. That said, there are things to draw out from that, right? Is it ethical to have an expressly partisan organization? Is that an ethical? And that's where I would draw the fundamental distinction, which is that I don't think those projects, I don't think New Left Media is a replacement for journalism. I don't think James O'Keefe is the future or a solution to journalism. What journalists do is better than what we do. It's harder than what we do, and it requires a great deal of ethics. Well, my pieces probably are something more akin to essays or opinion. They're pieces of you could call them activist journalism, although that might in itself be something of an oxymoron. I will touch on what he said, if I may, though. This idea of the double standard, that it's because he's, as you said, people close to the intelligentsia, you're covering interest of them, and that's why you're getting a hard time. I don't think that's true. You criticize the mainstream media, as I do. I think there's plenty of things wrong with it, but then you look to them to defend your own practices, saying, well, sometimes they've done it, right? ABC has done it. To Catch a Predator has done it. Mike Wallace does it. And I'm not sure that like the journalism community at large considers those examples to be very good ones. I think a lot of people have been critical of exactly those programs for a long time. But I'm really, again, my concern with it isn't even how you're representing yourself to the people you're covering. Because you represent yourself twice as a journalist. You do it to the subjects that you're approaching, and then ultimately you do it when you represent your subjects to your audience. And that's where I find ethical problems with James O'Keefe, and where I think you've gotten criticism, is that people have looked at what you've claimed to have found in your investigations, and they've looked at what the real situation was and found some discrepancy there. And that's where most of the criticism has come from. As an example, in this idea of what is the truth we're getting at here, he spoke about Planned Parenthood, and on time, I hope I'll finish up here. You've been watching these Republican debates. So it's like he said for Planned Parenthood, the truth he was getting at is that 100 years ago, there was this woman who was a racist who was giving a lot of money to Planned Parenthood. What does your prank phone call have to do with that? Nothing. It's like you don't find anything. That woman acted inappropriately. She shouldn't have said. She was clearly uncomfortable, didn't know how to respond. And so she said, excellent, excited. Okay, all of those things. She did the wrong thing. You definitely, no doubt about it. There's no way to let her off the hook for what she said. Did you find anything about Planned Parenthood? No. There was no truth you got at with an investigation. You staged something that doesn't happen. There isn't an epidemic of people calling up Acorn or Planned Parenthood and offering them money to get rid of black babies. That's not happening. You didn't find that. You created a fake scenario, and someone didn't respond very well, and they lost their job because of it.
When you said in your opening statement that you could never do the type of work that James does, going undercover, etc. Out of my own curiosity, when you went to the Glenn Beck rally, for example, and I'm supposing that a lot of the footage that you showed was from the Glenn Beck store, how did you identify yourself to the people that you talked to? Obviously, you weren't going undercover,
right.
But how did you approach them?
As a student. So, and that is an important question. I didn't approach them and say, "Hi, I work for New Left Media, and I'm here to interview people." And that's an ethical consideration. But there's a big difference in staging something and hiding a camera and creating a scenario and capturing it, and coming and saying, "Hi, I want to interview you. Here is my microphone. Here is my camera. Here are the questions." Right. So ultimately, we didn't tell them the venue that the product was going through, but there was no mystery as to what they were doing. They were giving interviews. That said, if I were a journalist working and then again, this is the point, there's a difference, I think, between activism and journalism. I think journalists would have a harder time making the distinction that they're not being honest about the venue through which what they're doing is being presented.
You don't have a problem with not fully representing yourself in that way?
Do I not have a problem with telling them that the videos are for New Left Media? No, I don't, because we're not supposed to be anyone's news outlet or anyone's news organization. We're making essays, we're giving interviews with people. That said, if the idea is that conservatives would only speak honestly if they thought they were speaking to a conservative journalist, that in itself, I'm not sure that that's exactly a good thing for them to claim. I will say this, our organization name was a bad choice. It's a bad choice because it allows people to dismiss what we do. We think that you can look at our pieces and that we give people the time to respond. We always represent the concerns that are voiced to us. We actually think we make very fair, very respectful pieces. Our organization name is basically the reason why we don't tell them who we're with. If we named ourselves the Project Veritas or Fox News, right, then I could just go tell them and they would say, "Oh, okay, news, right? Truth outlet." So our original thinking was we would name ourselves so that people would know our point of view from the get-go, so that we wouldn't be being disingenuous. It was the wrong choice because it requires us to be disingenuous on a different end of our work.
James, any response to Chase?
I think that one of the central components of this type of documentary filmmaking is that you catch them in their own words. And this enrages my opponents because they're trying to pigeonhole me or us well, you're a conservative Republican. Can you name one thing I've ever said that has been conservative? Well, you go after liberal organizations. So under your definition of a journalist, one ought not to go after liberal organizations, otherwise you're a conservative. No, I go after taxpayer-funded organizations. And mark my word, I'm a young guy, I'm 27, only been doing this for 2 years. I will be going after Wall Street. When I do that, they're going to put a hit out on me, but I mean, I will be going after these organizations. I believe that I need to compensate for where the media won't go. And you can read about Acorn and the New York Times and how they canceled the stories. This is about exposing people, and I commend Chase, because I think when he goes to the Glenn Beck rally and the Sarah Palin book signing, he catches them in their own words. It's not Chase describing what he thinks about conservatives. He's showing it. He's showing them in their own words. And that's what we do. We show people in their own words. We make them live up to their own book of rules. And when it comes to Planned Parenthood and the Margaret Sanger Institution, if you talk to people who are advocates at investigating Planned Parenthood, they will tell you that this was the reason, the bedrock upon which Planned Parenthood was founded. You may not like that. I'm just a messenger here. You may not like that fact. You may not like the fact that Margaret Sanger, who wasn't just a donor, but founded Planned Parenthood, was a eugenics sympathizer and didn't like black people. And I'm not going to repeat some of her quotes because they were so offensive. You may not like that fact, but that is a truth about the organization, the roots of this organization. And they put their clinics in inner city communities. Why do they do that? I mean, you'd think that liberals would care about this stuff. This cuts to the heart of who these people are. So it's not just a prank phone call. If it's just a prank phone call, then why did the vice president of Planned Parenthood resign? Why did President Obama defund Acorn? It wasn't Republicans who defunded Acorn. It was President Obama. Why did the CEO of NPR resign and the CFO of NPR resign? So there are some serious changes happening because of our work.
Next question,
Can I give a brief response?
Quickly, Chief.
Okay, quickly. So, okay, they put Planned Parenthoods in inner cities because they're places of population density. And not because they're trying to kill black children. And so that's a little bit outside of media criticism, but I just think that's a really nutty thing to say.
All right, so before I get tweety next. And actually, James, what you started to say gets to my next question. We talk about a lot of different forms of new media. We talk not only just in terms of what you do in terms of video, but the blogosphere, cable news, all sorts of things. And there is some suggestion that it's making us more partisan. Because as both of you begin to suggest that we're only going to sources with which we agree with the opinion ahead of time. Two-part question. I'm going to turn it over to Chase first. Is that a bad thing overall? And do you see what you do helping or trying to reverse that trend?
I think that's a great and important question. I do see that as a problem. I see our abundance of information, our abundance of media sources allows us to now selectively curate only information that we already agree with. The problem with that is that, like, take for instance, right now 1 in 3 Republican primary voters still think that they can't be sure that Obama was born in the United States, right? That's something that in a more scarce media environment would have been rooted out. It wouldn't have been given attention. Now there are bad things to this too. A scarce media environment where you had gatekeepers presiding over elite media also withheld stories, right? A famous, more recent example would be Newsweek sitting on the Monica Lewinsky story that the Drudge Report then came out and said, Newsweek's got some stuff on this. So it goes both ways. There's good and bad, and that gatekeeping elite can decide not to cover stories. But what we see today when people are getting their news from 50 online blogs and from their select cable news channel is that there's no ability for us to achieve any public consensus on the facts from which we premise public debate. And so public debate can't go forward because we can't agree if our president was born in the country or not. And those are the sorts of things that I think are a real danger if we have all of these partisan media outlets. To follow up on the second part of your question, which is do I contribute to that by producing myself partisan content? And And that's, again, an example of where I think our name becomes such a problem for us. The actual purpose of what we're doing is to show the consequences of partisan media, to show how those news narratives are manifest in the voting public. And when you talk to them, they're filled up with these partisan news narratives. The reason Acorn was defunded so hastily by Republicans, and yes, Obama signed it, was because they'd been carrying on about Acorn and voter fraud and all of these things and conservative media outlets for a long time. O'Keefe came along with his videos, and it exploded a narrative that had long been simmering. The conservatives acted, Democrats wanted to save face, they agreed with it, and of course Obama, in a case of political cowardice, agreed. But that doesn't mean we found out that Acorn was this crazy, evil institution. I think that answers your question.
I think that when it comes to this type of work, you don't characterize your subject. I very, very rarely, with the exception of Planned Parenthood, frankly, with the exception of that organization, I do not characterize Acorn, I do not characterize NPR, because I showed you videotapes. You can make your own decisions about what you think based on these tapes. In Chase's opinion, he thinks that it does not characterize them. That's fine. The Congress of the United States disagrees with you. The Congress of the United States, mostly Democrat, by the way, defunded Acorn. And the Congress of the United States, mostly Republican, defunded NPR. These people were the ones that made the decisions, not me. We live in a democracy. I show you information and people make decisions about it. I've never, in any of the videos, if you watch them, I don't sit there and, well, I think this and I think that. I think the problem with journalism is that it's all punditry, people talking about what they think, or it's stenography, people writing down what the politicians say. We dig. We show you the things that they won't say.
I'll follow up and I'll kick this over to each of you. Who do you think your audiences are right now? Do you have any background on who goes to your website? Who goes to your project? Do you have any knowledge? Do you have any idea of that? James.
Well, actually, we use a lot of social media, Facebook and Twitter, and I would say the Project Veritas, mostly kind of not the inner city intelligentsia community, as I mentioned, but we do have a lot of Tea Party fans, I will say that. A lot of people who want to expose government, fraud in government. And if we were to do an investigation in the corporations, which we may do, then we probably have a lot of fans over at the protests happening right now.
Jason.
It's actually been something we've really disliked, is what's happened with our audience. And another reason we dislike our name is we've created a partisan audience of people who demand from us increasingly simplistic, increasingly partisan content. And they don't like it when we sometimes cover negatively issues that are closer to liberals, as we did at the Restoring Sanity rally. So because it's the internet and because of our name, and I'm sure this is probably true of most of O'Keefe's audience too, even if that's not what he wants, that we have an entirely partisan internet audience. That's disappointing to me.
Are there steps that you envision taking to try and reverse that?
Yeah, make videos that are critical of liberals or certain liberal things. And we've done that, and it's amazing how many, we get a lot of small donations, how many people will email you and ask for their money back. But I want to respond to something else that James said, which is that he doesn't comment on the videos, he just shows you something and lets you decide. It's like Fox News, they report, you decide, right? Except that the headlines on his videos are massive corruption found in Acorn, right? And the way the videos are edited and constructed conveniently leave out those things which might not serve his ultimate point, and highlight those things which do serve his ultimate point. And I think that that's inherently commentary.
Right. James, do you want to respond to that? Or?
I mean, just one comment, that we post full, raw, unedited videos in adjacent to our produced tapes. So I can't name a single journalist in America who releases the full, raw, uncut, unedited. I mean, when it comes to editing, you have to stand in awe of the mainstream media. They edit everything. I've been on TV and they've cut me off. They've cut my mic off. They've edited everything I've ever been on TV has been edited. But Project Veritas always releases the full, raw, uncut, unedited videos on Vimeo and a produced version on YouTube.
If I may, That's right, all journalists edit, but that doesn't mean editing is value neutral. There's ethical editing and there's unethical editing. And one of the reasons you've gotten criticism for your project is that in releasing the raw footage, which I commend you for, they found discrepancies between what was in the raw footage and what was in your final piece. Another thing, in an abundant media environment, when there's no scarcity of media today, there's another thing, there's a scarcity of attention. Very few people are actually going to go through and watch all 2 hours of the NPR dinner. I did this last week. It's a lot of work to watch all of those raw tapes. You know people aren't going to do that. Those are the raw materials of journalism. So what you synthesize into your final report, which is a work of what a journalist would do, is supposed to be accurate and characterize accurately what's on those tapes. And you haven't done that because you know people aren't going to watch all 2 hours of a video to find those 2-second clips and words you've chopped out.
James.
All investigative reporters throughout history, when you file a FOIA request into a Temple University and you find that the university is wonderful and managed great, but there's one vice president who took $2,000 and put it in his wallet, what's your investigative report going to be about? Are you going to spend 5,000 words talking about the art department was managed properly, the accounting department was managed properly, and then in buried, headline's going to be, vice president puts $2,000 of taxpayer money in his wallet. That's what journalism does. You show the fraud, you show the headline, the waste, the fraud, the corruption. You edit the part that every newspaper has done this throughout history. But there's such a visceral reaction to what I do because people like the organizations I'm investigating that they're holding me to this outrageous double standard that no investigative reporter throughout history is held to. And by the way, can you name one Pulitzer Prize winning reporter who releases the full, raw, unedited notebook? No. But I'm expected to. It's an outrageous double standard. And I'm going to live up to it. I'm going to create a new standard, and I call upon all journalists to live up to our standards.
So talking about reporters, in doing some background reading on you, James, and there's a lot of different ways that you've described yourselves this evening. Chase, you described yourself as an activist. James, you described yourself now as a community organizer. One of the words that really struck me that you used to describe yourself is muckraker. And when I hear that term, the historian in me thinks back to Jacob Riis and Ida Tarbell and Upton Sinclair and Lincoln Steffens. I've read books and books of the muckrakers. And when you look at those journalists, you can point to major policy reforms that came out of their work. You think of the progressive era legislation that comes out of the muckrakers. Is that your vision for your work? Do you want to see, defunding Acorn is potentially one thing, but do you see bigger objectives for your work along the lines of those progressive journalists?
My vision is to make the world a more virtuous place. I think every journalist wants to do that. Make society more ethical and transparent. I want people to do the right things without being compelled to do them by governments or corporations or anyone. And the way to do that is in my heart and mind, I believe, is to expose what is true about the world we live in. What is it like inside of a Medicaid program? Do they give out money to people who need it, people who don't need it? If I expose Medicaid in 7 states and I show that they're giving money to people who identify themselves as members of the Irish Republican Army and who are shot, this is outrageous. And I think my goal in all this is to try to make society more ethical and more transparent. People do the right things.
Chase, do you feel the same way?
Well, that's very noble. I don't know that your work totally reflects that, though. Do I do the same thing? No. The main thing we're preoccupied with and that we focus on in our videos is showing the problems of what media does. So our preoccupation is the media itself as media makers. And so what we do is we go around and ask people, about their opinions. As the clip I showed earlier, you find that people are preoccupied with whatever the news is preoccupied with that week. And they tend not to go much beyond that. So we're trying to be critical of exactly what this partisan media landscape we're describing creates and causes. That said, we're also filmmakers, and these things are little aesthetic sandboxes for us, where we're playing. He says that in a few years he may cover Wall Street, right? young in his career. I'm much, much younger in my career. And a lot of what we're doing now is like, we're interested in cameras, and we're, so we don't claim to have as big of a, and that's a fundamental difference. One of the reasons that it is important for you to release the raw tapes is because you're claiming that you're finding big corruption. So we want to see the evidence, right? So we want to see that that's true. We know that there have been dubious editing practices before with some of your videos. So now when you're claiming something, it's like, well, show us the tape change, So it makes sense because you're claiming big things. We're not claiming there's some wild Tea Party conspiracy. We just want to show the ways in which their partisan news medias are shaping their discourse.
Is it possible for you to change journalism without being a journalist?
Yeah,
yourself?
well, yeah, absolutely. I think media critics do it all the time. I'd like to see ourselves more in that vein. Yes, absolutely. I think lots of people have. I mean, you could start naming media critics, from Neil Postman to Robert McChesney, Marshall McLuhan even, probably. And so, yes.
James, follow? Any to what Chase said?
I admire what Chase does. I think that showing people in their own words at Tea Party rallies. I just did this thing where I went to Wall Street and posed as a banker, and I caught a couple of really stupid people saying some really stupid things. I was only there for 25 minutes, so I interacted with only a few of them. But I would love to see the full, raw, uncut, unedited Chase tapes to see how many people he interacted with. It doesn't affect whether it's ethical or not, because he's still a journalist. Just like I believe that we're journalists, we show what are fundamental truths about certain cross-sections of the population. But just this notion of releasing full data, full raw tapes is something that we do and no one else does.
Are massive policy changes possible with you? You both say you catch people in their own words. You caught the guy from NPR, Planned Parenthood, etc. Do you see the massive changes that you want coming out of that method, or do you think you need to take what you do a step further?
I don't make the change. I mean, it's the policy stuff is not something that I advocate, never have. I don't know anyone in Congress. I don't talk to these people and walk up to them and lobby them. The work is just so outrageous that people are compelled to take action based on what we expose.
One of the websites that I like a lot in terms of these journalistic ethics is Pointer. I don't know if you read Pointer online or go to the website.
I'm not a big fan of mine, probably.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll leave that to be determined. I read a guy named Robert Steele who has, and we talked about this issue of undercover reporting. He has these 6 rules of what he considers ethical undercover reporting. And 2 of them that really jumped out at me were that the issue that you're talking about is of, and I'm using Robert Steele's words here, profound importance and exhibits systematic failure at top levels of government. With your work up until this point, do you first off, do you agree with the standard? And do you feel that your work, with some of what you've done, do you feel your work is meeting that standard?
I think there was an Apple commercial that Steve Jobs engineered where one of the quotes was, they're not fond of rules, they're the troublemakers of society, and you can quote them, vilify them, hate them, but you can't ignore them because they change things. This is a kind of a new genre here. Not comparing myself to Steve Jobs. I'm talking about something that Matt Drudge, the guy who runs a website, it's a broadsheet, and he still uses font from the typewriters use. And everyone visits his site. He doesn't play by the rules. You're supposed to have this beautiful website. James, when you do undercover work, you're supposed to, only target them in certain circumstances. Well, I don't like those rules. I disagree with him. I think that you use, in any area where there's no expectation of privacy and you're getting government money, I think it's ethical to use a hidden camera. And I think that it's unethical for these journalists to go to press conferences and just ask in front of a podium in their notebook, what do you think, Mr. Politician, about this? I think that's unethical because the politician is lying to the journalist, and the journalist is just writing down what the politician says.
Chase, do you feel the same way about the rules, or do you feel like there are still certain ethical standards that investigative reporting needs to follow.
Can you give me the two rules again?
The two rules again were that the issue had to be of profound importance.
Right.
Think Watergate, for example. That's the one that came to my mind. And then
The most profound, right.
Exhibiting systematic failure at top levels of government.
Well, one of the things I think we're hearing a lot in this back and forth rhetoric is that it's always journalists as stenographers, which I agree is a huge problem. But we're talking about them responding to what a politician is saying. You're saying it has to reveal corruption at the highest level of government. How about at the highest level of corporations? And so I would say that would be my modification, which is that you should seek to be revealing, not like that low-level employees sometimes don't respond the best at their day job when someone comes planning with this crazy scenario, to show them that they're, you know, it's like, it is much, which NPR is not an example of that, it's worth noting in terms of O'Keefe's work. But I think it is important to be trying to reveal something larger. So in our work, we try to reveal the consequence of partisan media. And I think we do that. And I'll address another thing he asked about releasing unedited tapes and everything. The statements you hear in our videos, people think we just pick like stupid statements or something, but actually we don't. If you watch our videos, you hear, if you look at public polling of the Tea Party, all of their issues and concerns are the same things you hear in our video. I don't know why it would come as any surprise to anyone. We regularly get people who are in the videos who email us, and they say, hey, I'm in your video. And you see people who comment, they say, well, you didn't get anything this time. Naturally, we edit them to be brisk, we edit them to be somewhat entertaining, and there's always like an element of humor that goes into them. But for the most part, I think we always accurately reflect what we're covering.
All right. I actually often ask this question of guest speakers who come into my classroom, and so I'll throw this out to you, and Chase, I'll put this to you first.
Okay.
If you could change one thing about the way our mainstream media does its job today, what would you change, and would that then not necessitate your place within what would be the one thing that you would change about the way media does its job today?
But there are so many.
Pick the best one.
Speed. In fact, James is right when he says that he didn't defund Acorn. And what the problem is speed. Let's take a different edited tape that's not one of James, but that his friend Andrew Breitbart also put out, Shirley Sherrod tape, where she appears to be saying she did not help a white farmer because he can get help from his own kind. Okay, so that tape came out and immediately shot through partisan media circuits, right? It was picked up on Fox News' website under the headline, racist Obama administration official, you know, your typical hyperbole, which is another problem I changed, but limiting to one, I'll focus on speed. Before that even was able to hit the airwaves, the Obama administration, knee-jerk reaction, sent word down from the highest levels to have the Health and Human Services, she was a farm agriculture, Georgia agriculture official. So someone from the USDA, I think Tom Vilsack, issued the order to go ahead and sack her, okay, before what they told her, they had her pull her car over off the road. They couldn't even wait for her to get to where she was going, and said, we want a resignation from you now because this is going to be on Glenn Beck tonight. And so this adherence to the now, speed, live updates, live tweeting everything, Gabrielle Giffords is dead, right? It's like we have this real problem with wanting everything to come now because the technology allows it. And so the main thing I would say is like, let's slow down, take time to get our facts right, give us time to contemplate the news that we're receiving, and then maybe we wouldn't defund an organization that had been helping inner city communities for 30 years and had 40,000 people around the country because some tapes came out showing someone praying for them.
Do you think that's more of a problem with how we consume media, or is that more of a problem with political leadership?
It's both.
Responding to that.
It's both. We've created a situation where politicians want to appear, now that we have a constant news cycle, it's what's called the CNN effect. Suddenly you have it so that the government officials want to appear like they are up and have a response and are acting proactively on all of the issues that are coming before them. And so the need for a government response, the pressure for the government to respond, quickly is greater than it's ever been, because you might explode into a crazed Fox News controversy if you don't respond, right? Where is the administration on this? And so it's both. The administrations, to save political face, tend to respond too brusquely, and the news media and us as news consumers have started thinking that having everything first means having everything. It's not the same thing as having everything of the most quality. In fact, I'd say those things are opposed to one another. The more time, the greater the quality of the media we consume. The less time it takes to be produced, usually the worse.
James, what would be the one thing that you would change?
I would say the media needs to be more courageous and needs to be more creative. If you look at TV, it's just all people talking to each other about what they think, and reading what's on the wire. Get on the front lines. I mean, I don't see what I do in terms of the right-left prism. I've been arrested and charged with a crime I haven't committed. I've been deprived my legal counsel. I've been deprived food and water while I was in a federal jail cell. I mean, this is about speaking truth to power. The highest levels of power we've investigated. Most people in this room are probably Democrats. It doesn't matter. Why is it that the media they're in the glossy booths in Manhattan behind microphones, and my guys are on the front lines risking their necks, risking their lives? My advice to the media is get on the front lines, be creative, be courageous, and actually do investigative reporting. Stop writing down what the politicians say and stop talking about what you think about the world, and try to expose the truth about the world.
All right, Chase.
I don't think that Project Veritas is risking their lives. I think that the people who work for NPR and the New York Times who are overseas and doing real investigations, those are real journalists, and they do risk their lives. Prank phone calls are not risking one's life.
Well, I mean, I've been charged with a crime I haven't committed, and I had my mugshot put on the front page of the New York Times.
Speaking of the New York Times, right, in terms of investigation, you see they're just stenographers. They just brought down 2 Democratic governors in a row through investigative journalism, real investigative journalism. That's not stenography.
I guess that's a question that I have, is that, we're talking about film and we're talking about Twitter and we're talking about, is there in this climate, and you talk about context and you talk about depth and you talk about all of the, do you still, as we talk about Steve Jobs, I saw a quote about Steve Jobs saying to somebody who ran a newspaper, what you do is great, but that's just not how we look at things anymore. Do you still see a place, even with the work that you do, for what we would consider traditional print journalism? Do you still see that surviving, maybe in a different manner, James?
I don't understand your question.
I'm sorry. Do you still see newspapers in this new media climate? Is there still a place for newspapers, for example, regardless of what you and Chase do with your work?
There's certainly a place for newspapers that do original content creation, original investigative reporting. My problem is not with newspapers; it's with people who sit in studios. And certainly I have great admiration for people who are overseas on the front lines. There are some good journalists, as Chase has pointed to. I think Chase is a good journalist. There are people who are on the front lines over in Libya and in Egypt. My problem is the people who make $10 million a year sitting in a studio booth in Manhattan, vilifying the people who are on the front lines. And I think it's disingenuous to suggest that there's so much hatred of what I do on the internet. I mean, is that what we want? We want people to stop holding senators, because I went into Senator Landrieu's office using a false pretense. I'm the worst person in the world. Julian Assange is a hero. Daniel Ellsberg is a hero. But James O'Keefe is the worst person in the world proposing is something he's not while inside of a politician's office. Shouldn't we be holding more politicians accountable? Shouldn't we be wanting more of these young people on the front lines, not less of them? But I have nothing but respect for the journalists who do good work at major newspapers.
Gentlemen, thank you both.
Thank you.
So now what we're going to do is we're going to lift the lights a little bit and take some questions from the audience, if there are any here. So Okay, so go in the front.
I have a question for Mr. O'Keefe, and that is, do you even actually know what journalism is? I mean, journalism is allowing the facts to determine the conclusion. What you do is allow the conclusion to determine the facts. That's in fact propaganda, not journalism. In fact, I go even further and say what you do is create right-wing partisan pornography that arouses the Glenn Beck demo and accomplishes not much else. My question is, do you know what journalism is?
I assume your question is rhetorical, so I'll wait for someone else's question.
This question, I'd actually like to hear Mr. O'Keefe's opinion, but it's for Mr. Whiteside. You've drawn this distinction between activism and journalism, and I'm wondering if you feel that there is a place where those two can overlap. And I would actually really like to hear your opinion as well, Mr. O'Keefe.
Yeah, I think they can overlap, and I think historically they have in many cases. I just want to say that whereas he gives me credit for being a good journalist, I do not think I am a good journalist. I think that's a bigger and harder thing to be. I think I'm a punk kid with a YouTube channel and a camera. I think we both are. That said, yes, I think activism and journalism can overlap. They have before, and people have managed to find and break big stories by starting out as activists first. One isn't coming to mind, but there are definitely examples of that, so I think they could, shouldn't they? Yeah.
Activism and journalism, I mean, all journalists are activists. I mean, there's no greater activist than the New York Times. All journalists have biases and prejudices that affect their reporting. So I think that the problem in the journalism schools is that, or there's this notion that you can somehow be an independent purveyor of anything. Everyone has biases. So I think that all journalists are activists, all good human beings are activists. So I think that it's kind of parsing words. But being on the front lines, being a muckraker, exposing something, that's considered activism. I think it's more in tune with journalism.
I think that, I guess what my question has to be from is, you compared yourself earlier, had a question about why someone like you hadn't won a Pulitzer Prize or exposed their notebook, per se, of notes and secrets. But I think you're using a different medium to address your viewers. And I'm interested in how you're comparing film and the written word. And do you understand my question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. The question is film versus the written word in the context of traditional journalism and
Yeah,
Pulitzer.
how you can hold yourself to the same type of ethics. Because I think that with the use of film, it holds a different standard of ethics than the written text ever could.
Sure.
So I'm wondering, as you hold yourself to that standard of ethics and the question of ethics, how you're manipulating that into film?
That's a good question. How do you contextualize film in the context of Pulitzers and text reporting? But I like to say that film doesn't mince words. When you get something on tape and you release it in its raw form, it's there. When reporters carefully describe things using language, I would consider that pornography. I would consider journalists today mincing words and carefully describing situations and events in order to give an illusion that something is a certain way. I don't give any illusions. I don't operate under the pretense of illusion. I show raw, streaming visual data, and you can decide how that employee looks and how he sounds. You don't have to have some intermediary describe it for you using particular language. I think that it's, and by the way, filmmakers are awarded Peabody Awards and journalism prizes. Documentary filmmakers like Michael Moore have won Academy Awards. So I think that you can compare the editing that's done in the newspaper and Matt Drudge. His revolutionary concept was arranging headlines, and he would take something on page A26 and put it as the banner. The establishment hated Matt Drudge for that. Who is this nobody, this Los Angeles hobo, to put the Monica Lewinsky scandal? That's not deserving of the headline. The newspapers have been editing everything since 1900. So filmmaking is revolutionary. Filmmaking journalism is revolutionary because it just shows raw streaming visual and you can decide. Yes.
Well, I think you run into controversy with that because you're editing yourself. You're calling out the newspapers and the mass media, which rightfully so, with questions of why are you editing this down to your opinions, etc., etc. You're not releasing though your pure unedited footage, and so how can you compare those two again?
Because we release the full, raw, unedited footage, and the newspapers never release the full, raw, unedited notebook, the reporter notebooks.
I think there's a somewhat disingenuous thread here, though, because it's not like you say that you don't comment on it, you're just giving raw, unfiltered footage, we're supposed to make up our own decision. But that's not really how you do it. The way you market your videos is you give them headlines saying you found big corruption. You go on a press tour telling everyone you found big corruption for various organizations. Your final videos include narration, music, chinchilla pimp fur coats that weren't actually worn, fur pimp coats that weren't actually worn. And so you are commenting on your media. That is, just as a writer would add adjectives or do whatever to it, you're doing the same thing. That's what editing is. You're right that video doesn't mince words, it's the editing that does. That's what creates the illusion.
Oh, I just wanted to kind of add on to what she was saying. Maybe you do present all the footage that you taped at the interviews and everything in the gotcha journalism that you do, which is fine because everyone has their own point of view, and in a democracy, to have the full span of every opinion on the stage is what's going to be best for public discourse. But at the same time, when you go into those places with this whole prank setup that we're going to expose this person for spending public money on something that's personal or whatever it is, in a sense that is your opinion going into it. And when you put that, even if it's the full footage, what other alternative do they have other than we decided this person's guilty without a trial, without all due process, and we'll let everyone decide what they think.
Do you think that Woodward and Bernstein had an opinion of Nixon?
I'm sure they did.
Of course they did. Of course they did. All investigative reporters have an opinion going into their investigation. The difference is, and everyone in this room needs to be intellectually honest with themselves. The reason you're against me is because you are ideologically opposed.
I'm not against you.
You're ideologically opposed. You're ideologically opposed to these organizations being investigated. Because the same standard that you hold me to, you do not hold traditional investigative reporters to.
Now, I gotta say, I don't think that's true. Just as I don't think that people are criticizing you because of who you investigate. Similarly, I don't think people are going after the New York Times when they investigated David Patterson or Elliot Spitzer's real-world hookers. Okay, it's like they're doing actual investigative journalism that's attacking liberals, right? And we're not coming after them for that. I think the reason people are critics of your work as heavily as they are is because your work has been inconsistently honest, perhaps consistently dishonest. And so another thing is you say that you're not setting out to go and do something as an activist, but you sent a fundraising email out that said, if I could raise $1 million, we could show 20 more examples of corruption in government. Isn't that what he said? You're deciding what you're going to find before you even do it?
There's plenty of corruption in society, and more people need to expose it. And I mean,
but you're not exposing real corruption.
I'm sorry?
You're not exposing real corruption.
I think that we're exposing corruption. I think that when you show taxpayer-funded institutions telling you how to declare prostitution as dependency on the tax forms, that is the purest form of dishonesty and self-dealing that you can. It's self-evident. I don't even want to debate that.
A day worker in an organization with 30,000 people who doesn't respond to your scenario very well, admittedly.
The President of the United States was an attorney for this organization with the day worker. I mean, this is about the White House and about millions of dollars of taxpayer money. And you're defending it under the pretense that it does good work and that there's just people are just day workers. It's our money. You're supposed to care about this stuff. You're taxpayers. But you don't care about it because you dislike the idea of a certain thing being investigated. That's what journalism is all about. It's about exposing things.
I agree. But I think you're flipping it. See, you're saying that we don't like what you do because you're attacking these organizations. But actually, you're attacking these organizations because you've politicized them. Conservatives don't like NPR. Conservatives don't like Acorn. Conservatives don't like Planned Parenthood. So you go out and attack them. You're the one doing like the partisan deciding about what gets covered. I don't think that's what people's problems are. It's like you're not going out and covering, say, like give me a conservative organization that the Heritage Foundation, perhaps the Koch brothers, perhaps Americans for Prosperity. Oh, they give you money, you wouldn't do that. You know, it's like, you're not doing that. You're covering only things that are pre-existing conservative narratives. You're the one being the partisan about what gets investigated.
Well, I don't think that government is partisan. I think that corruption is corruption, wherever it exists. There's plenty of it. So when I sent out an email, and by the way, I had to put this stuff on my credit card. You know, I put the NPR investigation on my credit card, and I had to spend our own money to do the Acorn investigation. And that's pretty remarkable. I mean, no funding from any major donors, totally dependent on people giving money through our website. But I think there's plenty of corruption in the United States, and there needs to be more people exposing it, less vilification of the people who do.
I agree with that. I just don't think that's what's happening.
Hello, I'm Todd Schaefer, Temple University student. My question is also for Mr. O'Keefe. You continue to call yourself a mud tracker?
Muckraker. I didn't call myself that.
Muckraker? Muckraker, my apology. I have a speech impediment. But in doing so and doing these investigative reporting, you are actually advocating for reform and regulation. How does that coincide with your idea against big government?
I have never advocated for policy, never made any type of advocacy. I have never done that, and I will not. All I do is yes, I make a headline, just like any Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist puts headlines above their work, just like Woodward and Bernstein did not like Nixon and set out to establish and confirm a thesis they had about him. That's the same thing that I do. And expose things, people in their own words. I don't advocate big government solutions or small government solutions to my work. That's not something I've ever advocated.
But like part of the rhetoric you use is that you say these are millions of government dollars, even though all those organizations are actually a very, very small part of the budget. If you really wanted to worry about like where dollars were being spent, you might choose like bigger fish.
We're going to take 2 more questions.
Hi, I'm Joseph Gibson. I'm a Temple University student as well. You said that you don't propose reform. Are you aware of the detrimental effects that you have when you're reporting these skewed reports?
I couldn't hear what your initial part of your question.
Okay. You say that you don't propose reform, but are you aware of the detrimental effects that you have?
The what?
The detrimental.
Documental?
No.
Detrimental, sorry.
Detrimental meaning bad, the bad effects that you have on people.
I mean,
Lives.
explain the detrimental effects. Explain that.
The detrimental effects of people losing their jobs, of big organizations, nonprofit organizations, losing funding, and they help people, and you said that you don't, well, you don't think they help people, but you said that you don't propose reform, but what you're doing, do you understand the bad effects of what it has on people?
Oh, would you support if I did an investigation of a faith-based coalition under the George W. Bush and they lost money? Would you think there'd be a detrimental effect if they lost taxpayer money? If George Bush lost his job, would you think that would be a detrimental effect? Would you support that journalism?
Well,
of course you would support it.
No, I wouldn't. I didn't say anything about my political beliefs at
the
all.
fundamental question.
So you're accusing me of because I'm asking you this question, I'm immediately against you.
The fundamental question is this. The fundamental principle is this. Do you support, would you support, or would you be against this type of activity if it investigated an organization in your
Okay, so you're saying if
Let me finish my...
somebody, okay, no, but you were saying somebody, a faith-based organization given George Bush money and they lost their funding, but isn't it supposed to be a separation between church and state?
Well, let me finish my fundamental answer to your question. The question is, would you support this detrimental effect? Would you think it's a detrimental effect if an investigation found fraud and waste and abuse in an organization, a right-leaning organization that got taxpayer money, and they lost their jobs? Would that be something that you would be against because it was a, quote, detrimental effect?
Well, what I'm asking, I'm not asking you to ask me a question. I'm asking you to answer the question.
But I'm.
That's what I'm asking. That's all I want.
And
I
I'm
want you
giving
to
you-
answer
and
the
I'm
question,
giving you
and
an
you're not answering it.
No.
Can you please answer it? Like, instead of giving me a question back?
I think James actually did answer your question, but I think your question touches on a more important issue, which is knowing, and I agree, you don't change policy. That's a result of the media taking your work and blowing it up into a huge story. But do you ever feel some responsibility for, do you think that there's a concern and that you have a responsibility as a media maker, especially one that's now known, that you're accurate in what you do with your work because of the ramifications it's obviously had? No matter the organization. It doesn't matter if it's a conservative or liberal organization for that question.
I think absolutely. Everything that we've done has been accurate. Everything we've done has been ethical. And the effects of our work is because people, citizens, mobilized in a democracy, they saw our work and they reacted to it. I did not defund Acorn. President Obama did, okay? Now, he did that because he was outraged. He called the actions of the employees inappropriate. And people and attorney generals have launched investigations. So my detrimental effects, I'm a documentary filmmaker. I expose things. We expose things. Expose people talking, okay? And that's what we do. I don't sit there with the lobbyists in Washington and say, you need to do this, you need to advocate certain policy, you need to fire this person. If she did nothing wrong, then don't resign. Apparently NPR thought it was extremely wrong for them to solicit an organization pretending to be the Muslim Brotherhood, and they all resigned. Okay, but they did that because of what we exposed. And that's what genuine investigative reporting is all about. It's about speaking truth to power, muckraking, and exposing things and letting people decide. I don't decide, people decide.
So you do think it's important to be accurate?
I think it's not only is it important to be accurate, but I back everything we've done up. I think it has been accurate and ethical, no difference than any other investigative reporter using a hidden camera, except we release the full raw tapes and 60 Minutes doesn't, NBC News doesn't, ABC's Primetime Live and Diane Sawyer doesn't. So I think that we've been plenty accurate.
I have a question about something that you had said, Mr. O'Keefe, is you defined the goal of journalism as being to create a more ethical and transparent world, and I hope I'm quoting you accurately.
Yes.
I certainly don't have a problem with the second part, but the first part, to create a more ethical world, is a highly subjective thing. It's basically, I view it as you creating what you believe to be a more ethical world, which I define as being activism rather than journalism. And I was wondering if you have an opinion about how your ethical beliefs impact your journalism. I'm also interested in Mr. Whiteside's opinions.
I believe that having a society free of waste, fraud, abuse, corruption, specifically using public resources to do bad things, I think that anyone, regardless of your political viewpoint, can agree that that is wrong. I don't think that it's a subjective belief for people to declare prostitution as a dependency on the IRS tax forms. I don't care whether you're a communist, Republican, atheist, theocrat. It's objectively wrong in a society for publicly funded organizations to be actively assisting someone in that manner. And I think that exposing it is a moral behavior. And I would expose anyone for the exact same thing being done against any organization, regardless of its political affiliation. So I don't think it's subjective at all.
I mean, I think ethics are subjective. It's why we have two different opinions of ethics on this stage, and why presumably there's a lot of different opinions in the audience. So I would say that, what was the second part of your question?
Basically that I would view an attempt to create a world based on your own personal ethics as being the opposite of what journalism is, and so it's
Okay.
basically how those two things would fit together. Your own personal ethics and an attempt to propagate them in journalism.
I mean, I'm not actually totally certain I get what the question is, but I'll respond using those words as a guide. So I think that people have a responsibility to, there are journalistic ethics that are, yes, some are being debated, but there are certain journalistic ethics that we hold paramount, or journalists hold paramount. And one of those is that you're accurately representing what it is you find. You go, you gather the information, and you don't distort it, you don't. And so I think that those ethics and a certain level of journalistic ethics are vital, otherwise it becomes a journalism of assertion and not a journalism of verification, which are two very, very different things. Does that
I had actually meant to clarify that I didn't mean journalistic ethics.
I'm sorry.
But rather, I mean, I was interpreting the phrase "to create a more ethical world" as being a larger view of ethics.
Ethical society is the
society, sure. As being, you're going to, of course, base that, as all of us do, off of your own personal view of what the ethics should be. And so to be doing that, I would align that with activism rather than journalism, which I view as the general definition being to present facts so that the society in general can define their own ethics.
Okay. That sounds like a statement.
I mean, it is a statement, but I'm looking for a kind of a response to that, and how, if you disagree, how you think that.
I think I mostly agree. People have a view of the world that in true objectivity is an unreachable ideal, and it always has been, and it was when the Watergate investigations were going on. There's no doubt that James is right about that. I think they brought a lot more to the table in terms of their investigation, and so they ended up being correct. So, but I think that one's point of views can't be separated totally from the journalism they carry out. Now, you can institutionalize journalism, and then you have editors and copy editors. These things are all sort of losing their jobs lately, and those institutions can adhere to a higher ethic than any one individual can. And so that's why I'm sort of bemoaning. I think the rise of citizen journalists is a lot of people view that as a really, really wonderful thing. I think it would be anarchy and all assertion. It would be what YouTube is if that was what journalism was. So I don't view it as favorably.
Thank you all very much for coming, and let's take our speakers.